I thank the member for Hindmarsh. The question is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Lawler.
Following the member for Kingston, in support of the Education Legislation Amendment Overseas Debt Recovery Bill and the Student Loans Overseas Debtors Repayment Levy Bill 2015. But I do so, Deputy Speaker, with some reservations. By creating an overseas repayment obligation, it is expected that these bills, as they stand, will affect 46,000 Australians that live and work overseas, with the expectation that 38,000 of these Australians will make repayments to their current student debts. Seems a reasonable thing to put forward, and reasonably on this side, we are therefore supporting it. The debts are owed by Australians who have accessed the Commonwealth Government's income contingent loans, which include help loans, HECS loans and now trade support loans. And because Labor has always stood up and supported education administration, and because this seems reasonable, the opposition is supporting the passage of these bills. Now, the government is anticipating that these bills will save an estimated $150 million over the 10-year forward estimates, $26 million over the next 4 years. Now, the mathematics in that is interesting, and I can only assume that the mathematics has been done on existing help or HECS loans, because I'm sure the figure would be much higher if it had been calculated and projecting forward around $100,000 degrees, of course, that the government seems intent to introduce into this country. So, on the one hand, this seems a reasonable thing, but I would take the time to make that point that it seems sensible to bring these measures into place. But it also fires a warning shot for me that, of course, if the government is planning for students to go into an extraordinary level of debt to access their education, then the government should also be planning debt recovery for people who are going to travel overseas. Because what was clear to me, Deputy Speaker, what was very clear to me throughout the last 2 years, when we've been talking about the deregulation of universities that the government plans that would ultimately lead to $100,000 degrees for Australian students, and therefore $100,000 debts for Australian students, it seemed to me, and I recall saying, that if I was a 20-year-old looking at a future that looked like that, I would probably look to going overseas. So it's probably sensible that we are looking to recover that debt if we're intending to harness our young people with such huge debt. Because it would have been sensible, therefore, take a few years and go overseas and build your career and not have to think about the debt back at home. So covering that loophole is probably sensible, but I think the government does understand, but they certainly do need to understand, that on this side of the House, that notion of $100,000 degrees is an absolute no from this side of the chamber. And it's been an absolute no in the Senate twice, and it's an absolute no from the Australian public. But the notion that it is right and reasonable for Australians, regardless of where they are living, be required to repay their student loans once they meet the income repayment criteria is reasonable. And obviously, in the past, as is most Australians' attitude, I think we've always thought that young Australians travel, whether they travel as backpackers, whether they travel to visit family in countries other than here, whether it's young people from my electorate travelling to Italy and catching up with uncles and aunts that they haven't seen for 20 years, whether it's people travelling back to England, whether it's people going back to the US, whether it's young people just exploring the world. Australians are great travellers, and in the last 40 years we've also learnt to be great workers in other countries. Many Australians building careers, getting valuable experience overseas in whether that be in commerce or in mining, in all sorts of areas of work. Australians are often now travelling overseas. But I think there's always been an assumption, and it's taken up in popular culture, that Australians ultimately, inevitably come home. One's reminded of some famous Australians still calling Australia home. But we have had that tradition, I think, or that belief that Australians will go and get their experiences, but they will come home. And so we've been fairly assured that when they come home successfully after having worked overseas, they will re-engage in the workforce here and will re-engage in repaying that debt. What the government is suggesting now, and I'm not suggesting they're wrong, is that perhaps we should be recovering that debt sooner. I don't have a problem with us seeking to do that, as long as the debt we're putting on our young people is a reasonable debt, as long as their education hasn't sent them scurrying from the country hoping not to have to repay it. The part of that too reflects a changing world where our young people aren't necessarily going to return home. So I think, therefore, that this is sensible. I think asking Australians living and working overseas to repay their loans has long been argued as being fair and equitable, and it's reasonable. And on this side, we also understand the importance of university education being affordable to all Australians, as I've said. It's long been argued by Labor, and it's worth making that point in this discussion today. So whilst we've got this legislation before us, with the Turnbull government seeking fairness and equity in the repayment of Commonwealth student loans, we also need to be absolutely clear that the fairness test has to be applied to what debt people are going to take on. And like the member for Kingston, I would note the New Zealand and the UK experiences here in that these systems are being trialled by some of our neighbours with some success. However, I would still have some concerns that a compliance of 70% implies a default of 30%, and that we need to look carefully at the communication strategies. We need to look very carefully to ensure that our young people who are involved in this get the information in a timely way, understand their obligations. We need to ensure that this is tracked through to make sure that we don't end up with default rates of 30%, ensuring that we're not chasing young Australians and that we're not putting any barriers in front of our young people of returning to this country because they've done that. So communication strategies are critical, absolutely critical. And now the revenue that this legislation seeks to ensure comes back to Australia, as I've said, also needs to be seen in those terms of, in this space and time, right now we are talking about help and HECS debts that are perceived by the Australian public to be reasonable, and therefore it is perceived to be reasonable to ask people, even while they're working overseas, that they begin to repay that if they've met that threshold. But it is imperative that we bear in mind that whenever we're talking about higher education in this place, in the current state, that we are talking about a government that is hell-bent it seems, in introducing a system of higher education that is Americanised to the point where young people, like the people in my electorate, may be locked out of higher education. Now, this would be a very, very sad state of affairs for Australia. It goes to the very heart of who we think we are. It goes to the very heart of who we want to be into the future. We want to make sure that in this country, access and equity at the forefront of our thinking. So I support the legislation today, Deputy Speaker, but I do so with those reservations, and I do so with a clear warning that it is my understanding of this government that we are seeking to close this loophole, but perhaps it is in preparation for another pursuit of its unfair agenda around putting $100,000 debts around the young people in this country so that they can secure their future. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.